Section 9 of And Even Now by Max Beerbohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 9. Hosts and Guests. 1918. Beautifully vague though the English language is, with its meanings merging into one another, as softly as the facts of landscape in the moist English climate, and much addicted though we always have been to ways of compromise, and averse from sharp, hard, logical outlines, we do not call a host a guest, nor a guest a host. The ancient Romans did so. They, with a language that was as lucid as their climate, and was a perfect expression of the sharp, hard, logical outlook fostered by that climate, had but one word for those two things. Nor have their equally acute descendants done what might have been expected of them in this matter. Hate and spite are as mysteriously equivocal as hopes. By weight of all this authority, I find myself being dragged to the conclusion that a host and a guest must be the same thing after all. Yet, in a dim and muzzy way, deep down in my breast, I feel sure that they are different. Compromise, you see, as usual. I take it that, strictly, the two things are one, but that our division of them is yet another instance of that sterling common sense by which, etc., etc. I would go even so far as to say that the difference is more than merely circumstantial and particular. I seem to discern also a temperamental and general difference. You ask me to dine with you in a restaurant. I say I shall be delighted. You order the meal. I praise it. You pay for it. I have the pleasant sensation of not paying for it. And it is well that each of us should have a label, according to the part he plays in this transaction. But the two labels are applicable in a larger and more philosophic way. In every human being, one or the other of these two instincts is predominant: the active or positive instinct to offer hospitality, the negative or passive instinct to accept it. And either of these instincts is so significant of character that one might well say that mankind is divisible into two great classes: hosts and guests. I have already, see third sentence of foregoing paragraph, somewhat prepared you for the shock of a confession which candour now forces from me. I am one of the guests. You are, however, so shocked that you will read no more of me? Bravo! Your refusal indicates that you have not a guestish soul. Here am I trying to entertain you, and you will not be entertained. You stand shouting that it is more blessed to give than to receive. Very well. For my part, I would rather read than write any day. You shall write this essay for me. Be it never so humble, I shall give it my best attention, and manage to say something nice about it. I am sorry to see you calming suddenly down. Nothing but a sense of duty to myself, and to guests in general, makes me resume my pen. I believe guests to be as numerous really as hosts. It may be that even you, if you examine yourself dispassionately, will find that you are one of them. In which case you may yet thank me for some comfort. I think there are good qualities to be found in guests, and some bad ones in even the best hosts. Our deepest instincts, bad or good, are those which we share with the rest of the animal creation. To offer hospitality, or to accept it, is but an instinct which man has acquired in the long course of his self-development. Lions do not ask one another to their lairs, nor do birds keep open nest. Certain wolves and tigers, it is true, have been so seduced by man from their natural state that they will deign to accept man's hospitality. But when you give a bone to your dog, does he run out and invite another dog to share it with him? And does your cat insist on having a circle of other cats around her saucer of milk? Quite the contrary. A deep sense of personal property is common to all these creatures. Thousands of years hence they may have acquired some willingness to share things with their friends. Or, rather, dogs may. Cats, I think not. Meanwhile, let us not be censorious. Though certain monkeys assuredly were of finer and more malleable stuff than any wolves or tigers, it was a very long time indeed before even we began to be hospitable. The cavemen did not entertain. It may be that now and again, say toward the end of the Stone Age, one or another among the more enlightened of them said to his wife, while she plucked an eagle that he had snared the day before, "That red-haired man who lives in the next valley seems to be a decent, harmless sort of person, and sometimes I fancy he is rather lonely. I think I will ask him to dine with us to-night." And presently, going out, met the red-haired man and said to him, "Are you doing anything to-night? If not, won't you dine with us? It would be a great pleasure to my wife. Only ourselves, come just as you are." "That is most good of you, but," stammered the red-haired man, "as ill luck will have it, I am engaged to-night. A long-standing formal invitation. I wish I could get out of it, but I simply can't. I have a morbid conscientiousness about such things." Thus we see that the will to offer hospitality was an earlier growth than the will to accept it. But we must beware of thinking these two things identical with the mere will to give and the mere will to receive. It is unlikely that the red-haired man would have refused a slice of eagle if it had been offered to him where he stood. And it is still more unlikely that his friend would have handed it to him. Such is not the way of hosts. The hospitable instinct is not wholly altruistic. There is pride and egoism mixed up with it, as I shall show. Meanwhile, why did the red-haired man babble those excuses? It was because he scented danger. He was not by nature suspicious, but what possible motive, except murder, could this man have for enticing him to that cave? Acquaintance in the open valley was all very well and pleasant, but a strange den after dark? No, no. You despise him for his fears? Yet these were not really so absurd as they may seem. As man progressed in civilisation and grew to be definitely gregarious, hospitality became more a matter of course. But even then it was not above suspicion. It was not hedged around with those unwritten laws which make it the safe and eligible thing we know to-day. In the annals of hospitality there are many pages that make painful reading. Many a great dark blot is there, which the recording angel may wish, but will not be able, to wipe out with a tear. If I were a host, I should ignore those tomes. Being a guest, I sometimes glance into them, but with more of horror, I assure you, than of malicious amusement. I carefully avoid those which treat of hospitality among barbarous races. Things done in the best periods of the most enlightened peoples are quite bad enough. The Israelites were the salt of the earth. But can you imagine a deed of colder-blooded treachery than Jael's? You would think it must have been held accursed by even the basest minds. Yet thus sang Deborah and Barak: "Blessed above women shall Jael the wife of Heber the Kenite be. Blessed shall she be among women in the tent." And Barak, remember, was a gallant soldier, and Deborah was a prophetess who judged Israel at that time. So much for the ideals of hospitality among the children of Israel. Of the Homeric Greeks, it may be said that they too were the salt of the earth, and it may be added that in their pungent and antiseptic quality there was mingled a measure of sweetness not to be found in the children of Israel. I do not say outright that Odysseus ought not to have slain the suitors. That is a debatable point. It is true that they were guests under his roof, but he had not invited them. Let us give him the benefit of the doubt. I am thinking of another episode in his life. By what Circe did, and by his disregard of what she had done, a searching light is cast on the laxity of Homeric Greek notions as to what was due to guests. Odysseus was a clever but not a bad man, and his standard of general conduct was high enough. Yet, having foiled Circe in her purpose to turn him into a swine, and having forced her to restore his comrades to human shape, he did not let pass the barrier of his teeth any such winged words as, "Now will I bide no more under thy roof, Circe, but fare across the sea with my dear comrades, even unto mine own home. For that which you didst was an evil thing, and one not meet to be done unto strangers by the daughter of a god." He seems to have said nothing in particular, to have accepted with alacrity the invitation that he and his dear comrades should prolong their visit, and to have prolonged it with them for a whole year, in the course of which Circe bore him a son, named Telegonus. As Matthew Arnold would have said, what a set! My eyes rove for relief to those shelves where the later annals are. I take down a tome at random. Rome in the 15th century. Civilization never was more brilliant than there and then, I imagine. And yet, no, I replace that tome. I saw enough in it to remind me that the Borgias selected and laid down rare poisons in their cellars with as much thought as they gave to their vintage wines. Extraordinary. But the Romans do not seem to have thought so. An invitation to dine at the Palazzo Borghese was accounted the highest social honour. I am aware that in recent books of Italian history there has been a tendency to whiten the Borgias' characters, but I myself hold to the old romantic black way of looking at the Borgias. I maintain that though you would often in the 15th century have heard the snobbish Roman say, in a would-be offhand tone, "I am dining with the Borgias to-night," no Roman ever was able to say, "I dined last night with the Borgias." To mankind in general, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth stand out as the supreme type of all that a host and hostess should not be. Hence the marked coolness of Scotsmen towards Shakespeare. Hence the untiring efforts of that proud and sensitive race to set up Burns in his stead. It is a risky thing to offer sympathy to the proud and sensitive. Yet I must say that I think the Scots have a real grievance. The two actual historic Macbeths were no worse than innumerable other couples in other lands that had not yet fully struggled out of barbarism. It is hard that Shakespeare happened on the story of that particular pair, and so made it immortal. But he meant no harm, and, let Scotsmen believe me, did positive good. Scotch hospitality is proverbial. As much in Scotland as in America does the English visitor blush when he thinks how perfunctory and niggard, in comparison, English hospitality is. It was Scotland that first formalised hospitality, made of it an exacting code of honour, with the basic principle that the guest must in all circumstances be respected and at all costs protected. Jacobite history bristles with examples of the heroic sacrifices made by hosts for their guests, sacrifices of their own safety and even of their own political convictions, for fear of infringing, however slightly, that sacred code of theirs. And what was the origin of all this noble pedantry? Shakespeare's Macbeth. Perhaps if England were a bleak and rugged country like Scotland, or a new country like America, the foreign visitor would be more overwhelmed with kindness here than he is. The landscapes of our countryside are so charming, London abounds in public monuments so redolent of history, so romantic and engrossing, that we are perhaps too apt to think the foreign visitor would have neither time nor inclination to sit dawdling in private dining-rooms. Assuredly, there is no lack of hospitable impulse among the English. In what may be called mutual hospitality, they touch a high level. The French, also the Italians, entertain one another far less frequently. In England, the native guest has a very good time indeed. though of course he pays for it in some measure by acting as host too from time to time. In practice, no, there cannot be any absolute division of mankind into my two categories, hosts and guests. But psychologically, a guest does not cease to be a guest when he gives a dinner, nor is a host not a host when he accepts one. The amount of entertaining that a guest need do is a matter wholly for his own conscience. He will soon find that he does not receive less hospitality for offering little, and he would not receive less if he offered none. The amount received by him depends wholly on the degree of his agreeableness. Pride makes an occasional host of him, but he does not shine in that capacity, nor do hosts want him to essay it. If they accept an invitation from him, they do so only because they wish not to hurt his feelings. As guests, they are fish out of water. Circumstances do, of course, react on character. It is conventional for the rich to give and for the poor to receive. Riches do tend to foster in you the instincts of a host, and poverty does create an atmosphere favourable to the growth of guestish instincts. But strong bents make their own way. Not all guests are to be found among the needy, nor all hosts among the affluent. For 16 years after my education was, by courtesy, finished, from the age, that is, of 22 to the age of 38, I lived in London, seeing all sorts of people all the while. And I came across many a rich man who, like the master of the shepherd Corin, was of churlish disposition, and little recked to find the way to heaven by doing deeds of hospitality. On the other hand, I knew quite poor men who were incorrigibly hospitable. To such men all honour. The most I dare claim for myself is that if I had been rich, I should have been better than Corin's master. Even as it was, I did my best, but I had no authentic joy in doing it. Without the spur of pride, I might conceivably have not done it at all. There recurs to me from among memories of my boyhood an episode that is rather significant. In my school, as in most others, we received now and again hampers from home. At the midday dinner in every house we all ate together, but at breakfast and supper we ate in 4 or 5 separate messes. It was customary for the receiver of a hamper to share the contents with his messmates. On one occasion I received, instead of the usual variegated hamper, a box containing 12 sausage rolls. It happened that when this box arrived and was opened by me, there was no one around. Of sausage rolls I was particularly fond. I am sorry to say that I carried the box up to my cubicle, and, having eaten 2 of the sausage rolls, said nothing to my friends that day about the other 10, nor anything about them when, 3 days later, I had eaten them all up there alone. 30 years have elapsed. My schoolfellows are scattered far and wide. The chance that this page may meet the eyes of some of them does not much dismay me, but I am glad there was no collective and contemporary judgment by them on my strange exploit. What defence could I have offered? Suppose I had said, "You see, I am so essentially a guest." The plea would have carried little weight. And yet it would not have been a worthless plea. On receipt of a hamper, a boy did rise always in the esteem of his messmates. His sardines, his marmalade, his potted meat, at any rate while they lasted, did make us think that his parents must be awfully decent, and that he was a not unworthy son. He had become our central figure. We expected him to lead the conversation. We liked listening to him. His jokes were good. With those 12 sausage rolls I could have dominated my fellows for a while. But I had not a dominant nature. I never trusted myself as a leader. Leading abashed me. I was happiest in the comity of the crowd. Having received a hamper, I was always glad when it was finished, glad to fall back into the ranks. Humility is a virtue, and it is a virtue innate in guests. Boys, as will have been surmised from my record of the effect of hampers, are all of them potential guests. It is only as they grow up that some of them harden into hosts. It is likely enough that if I, when I grew up, had been rich, my natural bent to guestship would have been diverted, and I too have become a sort of host, and perhaps I should have passed muster. I suppose I did pass muster whenever, in the course of my long residence in London, I did entertain friends. But the memory of those occasions is not dear to me, especially not the memory of those that were in the more distinguished restaurants. Somewhere in the back of my brain, while I tried to lead the conversation brightly, was always the haunting fear that I had not brought enough money in my pocket. I never let this fear master me. I never said to anyone, "Will you have a liqueur?" Always, "What liqueur will you have?" But I postponed as far as possible the evil moment of asking for the bill. When I had, in the proper casual tone, I hope and believe, at length asked for it, I wished always it were not brought to me folded on a plate, as though the amount were so hideously high that I alone must be privy to it. So soon as it was laid beside me, I wanted to know the worst at once. But I pretended to be so occupied in talk that I was unaware of the bill's presence. And I was careful to be always in the middle of a sentence when I raised the upper fold and took my not, I hope, frozen glance. In point of fact, the amount was always much less than I had feared. Pessimism does win us great happy moments. Meals in the restaurants of Soho tested less severely the pauper guest masquerading as host. But to them one could not ask rich persons, nor even poor persons, unless one knew them very well. Soho is so uncertain that the fare is often not good enough to be palmed off on even one's poorest and oldest friends. A very magnetic host, with a great gift for bluffing, might, no doubt, even in Soho's worst moments, diffuse among his guests a conviction that all was of the best. But I never was good at bluffing. I had always to let food speak for itself. "It's cheap," was the only paean that in Soho's bad moments ever occurred to me, and this, of course, I did not utter. And was it so cheap, after all? Soho induces a certain optimism. A bill there was, always larger than I had thought it would be. Everyone, even the richest and most munificent of men, pays much by cheque more light-heartedly than he pays little in specie. In restaurants I should have liked always to give cheques. But in any restaurant I was so much more often seen as guest than as host that I never felt sure the proprietor would trust me. Only in my club did I know the luxury, or rather the painlessness, of entertaining by cheque. A cheque, especially if it is a club cheque, as supplied for the use of members, not a leaf torn out of his own book, makes so little mark on any man's imagination. He dashes off some words and figures, he signs his name with that vague momentary pleasure which the sight of his own signature anywhere gives him, he walks away and forgets. Offering hospitality in my club, I was inwardly calm. But even there I did not glow, though my face and manner, I hope, glowed. If my guest was by nature a guest, I managed to forget somewhat that I myself was a guest by nature. But if, as now and then happened, my guest was a true and habitual host, I did feel that we were in an absurdly false relation. And it was not without difficulty that I could restrain myself from saying to him, "This is all very well, you know, but, frankly, your place is at the head of your own table." The host as guest is far, far worse than the guest as host. He never even passes muster. The guest, in virtue of a certain hability that is part of his natural equipment, can more or less ape the ways of a host. But the host, with his more positive temperament, does not even attempt the graces of a guest. By graces I do not mean to imply anything artificial. The guest's manners are, rather, as wild flowers springing from good rich soil, the soil of genuine modesty and gratitude. He honourably wishes to please in return for the pleasure he is receiving. He wonders that people should be so kind to him, and, without knowing it, is very kind to them. But the host, as I said earlier in this essay, is a guest against his own will. That is the root of the mischief. He feels that it is more blessed, etc., and that he is conferring rather than accepting a favour. He does not adjust himself. He forgets his place. He leads the conversation. He tries genially to draw you out. He never comments on the goodness of the food or wine. He looks at his watch abruptly and says he must be off. He doesn't say he has had a delightful time. In fact, his place is at the head of his own table. His own table, over his own cellar, under his own roof. It is only there that you see him at his best. To a club or restaurant he may sometimes invite you, but not there, my child, do you get the full savour of his quality. In life or literature there has been no better host than old Wardle. Appalling though he would have been as a guest in club or restaurant, it is hardly less painful to think of him as a host there. At Dingley Dell, with an ample gesture, he made you free of all that was his. He could not have given you a club or a restaurant, nor, when you come to think of it, did he give you Dingley Dell. The place remained his. None knew better than old Wardle that this was so. Hospitality, as we have agreed, is not one of the most deep-rooted instincts in man, whereas the sense of possession certainly is. Not even old Wardle was a communist. This, you may be sure he said to himself, is my roof. These are my horses. That's a picture of my dear old grandfather. And this, he would say to us, is my roof. Sleep soundly under it. These are my horses. Ride them. There's a portrait of my dear old grandfather. Have a good look at it. But he did not ask us to walk off with any of these things. Not even what he actually did give us would he regard as having passed out of his possession. That, he would muse, if we were torpid after dinner, is my roast beef. And that, if we staggered on the way to bed, is my cold milk punch. But surely, you interrupt me, to give and then not feel that one has given is the very best of all ways of giving. I agree. I hope you didn't think I was trying to disparage old Wardle. I was merely keeping my promise to point out that from among the motives of even the best hosts, pride and egoism are not absent. Every virtue, as we were taught in youth, is a mean between two extremes. And I think any virtue is the better understood by us if we glance at the vice on either side of it. I take it that the virtue of hospitality stands midway between churlishness and mere ostentation. Far to the left of the good host stands he who doesn't want to see anything of anyone. Far to the right, he who wants a horde of people to be always seeing something of him. I conjecture that the figure on the left, just discernible through my field glasses, is that of old Corin's master. His name was never revealed to us, but Corin's brief account of his character suffices. Deeds of hospitality is a dismal phrase that could have occurred only to the servant of a very dismal master. Not less telltale is Corin's idea that men who do these deeds do them only to save their souls in the next world. It is a pity Shakespeare did not actually bring Corin's master onto the stage. One would have liked to see the old man genuinely touched by the charming eloquence of Rosalind's appeal for a crust of bread, and conscious that he would probably go to heaven if he granted it, and yet not quite able to grant it. Far away though he stands to the left of the good host, he has yet something in common with that third person discernible to the right, that speck yonder, which I believe to be Lucullus. Nothing that we know of Lucullus suggests that he was less inhuman than the churl of Arden. It does not appear that he had a single friend, nor that he wished for one. His lavishness was indiscriminate, except in that he entertained only the rich. One would have liked to dine with him, but not even in the act of digestion could one have felt that he had a heart. One would have acknowledged that in all the material resources of his art he was a master, and also that he practised his art for sheer love of it, wishing to be admired for nothing but his mastery, and cocking no eye on any of the ulterior objects, but for which some of the most prominent hosts would not entertain at all. But the very fact that he was an artist is repulsive. When hospitality becomes an art, it loses its very soul. With this reflection, I look away from Lucullus, and, fixing my gaze on the middle ground, am the better able to appreciate the excellence of the figure that stands before me, the figure of old Wardle. Some pride and egoism in that capacious breast, yes, but a great heart full of kindness, and ever a warm spontaneous welcome to the stranger in need, and to all old friends and young. Hark! He is shouting something. He is asking us both down to Dingley Dell. And you have shouted back that you will be delighted. Ah, did I not suspect from the first that you too were perhaps a guest? But I constrain you in the act of rushing off to pack your things. One moment. This essay has yet to be finished. We have yet to glance at those two extremes between which the mean is good guestship. Far to the right of the good guest we descry the parasite. Far to the left, the churl again, not the same churl, perhaps. We do not know that Corin's master was ever sampled as a guest. I am inclined to call yonder speck Dante Alighieri, of whom we do know that he received during his exile much hospitality from many hosts, and repaid them by writing how bitter was the bread in their houses, and how steep the stairs were. To think of dour Dante as a guest is less dispiriting only than to think what he would have been as a host, had it ever occurred to him to entertain any one or anything except a deep regard for Beatrice. And one turns with positive relief to have a glimpse of the parasite. Mr. Smurge, I presume, whose gratitude was as boundless as his appetite, and his presence as unsought as it appeared to be inevitable. But now, how gracious and admirable is the central figure, radiating gratitude, but not too much of it, never intrusive, ever within call, full of dignity, yet all amenable, quiet, yet lively, never echoing, ever amplifying, never contradicting, but often lighting the way to truth, an ornament, an inspiration, anywhere. Such is he. But who is he? It is easier to confess a defect than to claim a quality. I have told you that when I lived in London I was nothing as a host, but I will not claim to have been a perfect guest, nor indeed was I. I was a good one, but looking back, I see myself not quite in the centre, slightly to the left, slightly to the churlish side. I was rather too quiet, and I did sometimes contradict. And though I always liked to be invited anywhere, I very often preferred to stay at home. If any one hereafter shall form a collection of the notes written by me in reply to invitations, I am afraid he will gradually suppose me to have been more in request than ever I really was, and to have been also a great invalid, and a great traveller. End of section 9. Section 10 of And Even Now by Max Beerbohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 10. A Point to be Remembered by Very Eminent Men. 1918. One of the things a man best remembers in later years is the first time he set eyes on some illustrious elder whose achievements had already inflamed him to special reverence. In almost every autobiography you will find recorded the thrill of that first sight. With the thrill, perhaps, there was a slight shock. Great men are but life-sized. Most of them, indeed, are rather short. No matter to hero-worshipping youth. The shock did but swell the thrill. It did but enlarge the wonder that this was the man himself. The man who, I was about to say, who had written those inspired books. You see, the autobiographists are usually people with an innate twist towards writing, people whose heroes, therefore, were men of letters. And thus, especially as I myself have that twist, I am apt to think of literary hero-worship as flourishing more than could any other kind. I must try to be less narrow. At first sight of the Lord Chancellor, doubtless, unforgettable emotions rise in the breast of a young man who has felt, from his earliest years, the passionate desire to be a lawyer. One whose dream it is to excel in trade will have been profoundly stirred at finding himself face to face with Sir Thomas Lipton. At least, I suppose so. I speak without conviction. I am inclined, after all, to think that there is, in the literary temperament, a special sensibility whereby these great first envisagements mean more to it than to natures of a more practical kind. So it is primarily to men very eminent in literature that I venture to offer a hint for making those envisagements as great as possible. The hint will serve only in certain cases. There are various ways in which a young man may chance to see his hero for the first time. One wintry afternoon, not long after I came to London, the autobiographist will tell you, I happened to be in Cheyne Walk, bent on I know not what errand, when I saw, coming slowly along the pavement, an old grey-bearded man. He wore a hat of the kind that was called, in those days, a wide-awake, and he leaned heavily on a stick, which he carried in his right hand. I stood reverently aside to let him pass, the man who had first taught me to see, to feel, to think. Yes, it was Thomas Carlyle. And as he went by, looking neither to the right nor to the left, my heart stood still within me. What struck me most in that thought-furrowed face was the eyes. I have never since, seen a pair of eyes which... etc., etc. This is well enough, and I don't say that the writer has exaggerated the force of the impression he received. I say merely that the impression would have been stronger still if he had seen Carlyle in a room. The open air is not really a good setting for a hero. It is too diffuse. It is too impersonal. 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor. These things are needed to concentrate, for the worshipper, the vision vouchsafed. Even if the room be a public one, a waiting-room, say, at Clapham Junction, it is very helpful. Far more so if it be a room in a private house, where, besides the vision itself, is thrust on the worshipper the dizzy sense of a personal relationship. Dip with me, for an example, into some other autobiography. Here. Shortly after I came to London, it is odd that autobiographists never are born or bred there, one of the houses I found open to me was that of Mrs. T, a woman whom, So it seemed to me when in later years I studied Italian. The word simpatica described exactly, and who, as the phrase is, knew everybody. Calling on her one Sunday afternoon, I noticed among the guests as I came in a short, stalwart man with a grey beard. "I particularly," my hostess whispered to me, "want you to know Mr. Robert Browning." Everything in the room seemed to swim round me, and I had the sensation of literally sinking through the carpet, when, presently, I found my hand held for a moment (it was only a moment, but it seemed to me an eternity) by the hand that had written Paracelsus. I had a confused impression of something godlike about the man. His brow was magnificent, but the eyes were what stood out. Not that they were prominent eyes, but they seemed to look you through and through, and had a lustre, there is no other word for it, which, I maintain, would have been far less dazzling out in the street, just as the world sadness of Carlyle's eyes would have been twice as harrowing in Mrs. T.'s drawing-room. But even there neither of those pairs of eyes could have made its fullest effect. The most terrifically gratifying way of seeing one's hero and his eyes for the first time is to see them in his own home. Anywhere else, believe me, something of his essence is forfeit. The rose of roses loses more or less of its beauty in any vase, and rather more than less there, in a nosegay of ordinary little blossoms, to which I rather rudely liken Mrs. T.'s other friends. The supreme flower should first be seen growing from its own Sharonian soil. The worshipper should have, therefore, a letter of introduction. Failing that, he should write a letter introducing himself, a fervid, an idolatrous letter, not without some excuse for the writing of it. The hero's 70th birthday, for instance. Heroes are very human, most of them, very easily touched by praise. Some of them, however, are bad at answering letters. The worshipper must not scruple to write repeatedly, if need be. Sooner or later he will be summoned to the presence. This, perhaps, will entail a railway journey. Heroes tend to live a little way out of London. So much the better. The adventure should smack of pilgrimage. Consider also that a house in a London street cannot seem so signally its owner's own as can a house in a village or among fields. The one kind contains him, the other enshrines him, breathes of him. The sight of it after a walk (there should be a longish walk) from the railway station strikes great initial chords in the worshipper, and the smaller the house, the greater the chords. The worshipper pauses at the gate of the little front garden, and when he writes his autobiography, those chords will be reverberating yet. Here it was that the greatest of modern spirits had lived and wrought. Here, in the fullness of years, he abode. With I know not what tumult of thoughts, I passed up the path and rang the bell. A bright-faced parlour-maid showed me into a room on the ground floor, and said she would tell the master I was here. It was a wonderfully simple room, and something, perhaps the writing-table, told me it was his work-room, the very room from which, in the teeth of the world's neglect and misunderstanding, he had cast his spell over the minds of all thinking men and women. When I had waited a few minutes, the door opened, and... After that, the deluge of what was felt when the very eminent man came in. Came in, mark you. That is a vastly important point. Had the very eminent man been there at the outset, the worshipper's first sight of him would have been a very great moment, certainly, but not nearly so great as in fact it was. Very eminent men should always, on these occasions, come in. That is the point I ask them to remember. Honourably concerned with large, high issues, they are not students of personal effect. I must therefore explain to them why it is more impressive to come into a room than to be found there. Let those of them who have been playgoers cast their minds back to their experience of theatres. Can they recall a single play in which the principal actor was 'discovered' sitting or standing on the stage when the curtain rose? No. The actor, by the very nature of his calling, must study personal effect. No playwright would dare to dump down his principal actor at the outset of a play. No sensible playwright would wish to do so. That actor's personality is a part of the playwright's material. Playwriting, it has been well said, is an art of preparing. The principal actor is one of the things for which we must be artfully prepared. Note Shakespeare's carefulness in this matter. In his day the stage had no curtain, so that even the obscure actor who spoke the first lines, Shakespeare himself sometimes, maybe, was not ignominiously 'discovered.' But an unprepared entry is no good. The audience must first be wrought on, wrought up. Had Shakespeare been also Burbage, it is possible that he would have been even more painstaking than he was in leading up to the leading man. Assuredly, by far the most tremendous stage entries I ever saw were those of Mr. Wilson Barrett in his later days, the days when he had become his own dramatist. I remember particularly a first night of his, at which I happened to be sitting next to a clever, but not very successful and rather sardonic old actor. I forget just what great historic or mythic personage Mr. Barrett was to represent, but I know that the earlier scenes of the play resounded with rumours of him, accounts of the great deeds he had done, and of the yet greater deeds that were expected of him. And, at length, there was a procession. White-bearded priests bearing wands, maidens playing up the sackbut, guards in full armour, a pell-mell of unofficial citizens ever prancing along the edge of the pageant, huzzaing and hosannaing, mostly looking back over their shoulders and shading their eyes, maidens strewing rose-leaves, and, at last, the orchestra crashing to a climax, in the nick of which my neighbour turned to me and, with an assumption of innocent enthusiasm, whispered, "I shouldn't wonder if this were Barrett." I suppose, Mr. Barrett at that instant amply appearing, I gave way to laughter. But this didn't matter. The applause would have drowned a thunderstorm, and lasted for several minutes. My very eminent reader begins to look uncomfortable. Let him take heart. I do not want him to tamper with the simplicity of his household arrangements. Not even the one bright-faced parlour-maid need precede him with strewn petals. All the necessary preparation will have been done by the bare fact that this is his room, and that he will presently appear. "But," he may say with a toss of his grey beard, "I am not going to practise any device whatsoever. I am above devices. I shall be in the room when the young man arrives." I assure him that I am not appealing to his vanity, merely to his good nature. Let him remember that he too was young once, he too thrilled in harmless hero-worship. Let him not grudge the young man an utmost emotion. Coming into a room that contains a stranger is a definite performance, a deed of which one is conscious, if one be young and if that stranger be august. Not to come in awkwardly, not to make a bad impression, is here the paramount concern. The mind of the young man, as he comes in, is clogged with thoughts of self. It is free of these impediments if he shall have been waiting alone in the room. To be come into is a thing that needs no art, and induces no embarrassment. One's whole attention is focussed on the comer in. One is the mere spectator, the passive and receptive receiver. And even supposing that the young man could come in, under his hero's gaze, without a thought of self, his first vision would yet lack the right intensity. A person found in a room, if it be a room strange to the arriver, does not instantly detach himself from his surroundings. He is but a feature of the scene. He does not stand out, as against a background, in the grand manner of portraiture, but is fused, as in an elaborately rendered interior. It is all the more essential, therefore, that the worshipper shall not have his first sight of hero and room simultaneously. The room must, as it were, be an anteroom, anon converted into a presence chamber by the hero's entry. And let not the hero be in any fear that he will bungle his entry. He has but to make it. The effect is automatic. He will stand out by merely coming in. I would but suggest that he must not, be he never so hale and hearty, bounce in. The young man must not be startled. If the mountain had come to Mahomet, it would, we may be sure, have come slowly, that the prophet should have time to realise the grandeur of the miracle. Let the hero remember that his coming, too, will seem supernatural to the young man. Let him be framed for an instant or so in the doorway, time for his eyes to produce their peculiar effect. And, by the way, if he be a wearer of glasses, he should certainly remove these before coming in. He can put them on again almost immediately. It is the first moment that matters. As to how long an interval the hero should let elapse between the young man's arrival and his own entry, I cannot offer any very exact advice. I should say, roughly, that in 10 minutes the young man would be strung up to the right pitch, and that more than 20 minutes would be too much. It is important that expectancy shall have worked on him to the full, but it is still more important that his mood shall not have been chafed to impatience. The danger of overlong delay is well exemplified in the sad case of young Coventry Patmore. In his old age, Patmore wrote to Mr. Gosse a description of a visit he had paid, at the age of 18, to Leigh Hunt. And you will find the letter on page 32, volume 1, of Mr. Basil Champneys' biography of him. The circumstances had been most propitious. The eager and sensitive spirit of the young man, his intense admiration for the story of Rimini, the letter of introduction from his father to the venerable poet and friend of greater bygone poets, the long walk to Hammersmith, the small house in a square there, all was classically in order. The poet was at home. The visitor was shown in. I had, he was destined to tell Mr. Gosse, waited in the little parlour at least 2 hours, when the door was opened and a most picturesque gentleman, with hair flowing nearly or quite to his shoulders, a beautiful velvet coat, and a Vandyke collar of lace about a foot deep, appeared, rubbing his hands and smiling ethereally, and saying, without a word of preface or notice of my having waited so long, "This is a beautiful world, Mr. Patmore." The young man was so taken aback by these words that they eclipsed all memory of what occurred during the remainder of the visit. Yet there was nothing wrong about the words themselves. Indeed, to any one with any sense of character and any knowledge of Leigh Hunt, they must seem to have been exactly, exquisitely, inevitably the right words. But they should have been said sooner. End of section 10. Section 11 of And Even Now, by Max Beerbohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 11. Servants, 1918. It is unseemly that a man should let any ancestors of his arise from their graves to wait on his guests at table. The Chinese are a polite race, and those of them who have visited England and gone to dine in great English houses will not have made this remark aloud to their hosts. I believe it is only their own ancestors that they worship, so that they will not have felt themselves guilty of impiety in not rising from the table and rushing out into the night. Nevertheless, they must have been shocked. The French Revolution, judged according to the hope it was made in, must be pronounced a failure. It effected no fundamental change in human nature, but it was by no means wholly ineffectual. For example, ladies and gentlemen ceased to powder their hair because of it, and gentlemen adopted simpler costumes. This was so in England as well as in France. But in England ladies and gentlemen were not so nimble-witted as to be able to conceive the possibility of a world without powder. Powder had been sent down from heaven, and must not vanish from the face of the earth. Said Sir John to his lady, "'Tis a matter easy to settle. Your maid Deborah and the rest of the wenches shall powder their hair henceforth." Whereat his lady exclaimed in wrath, "Lud, Sir John, have you taken leave of your senses? A parcel of Abigails flaunting about the house in powder? Oh, preposterous!" Whereat Sir John exclaimed, "Zounds!" and hotly demonstrated that since his wife had given up powder, there could be no harm in its assumption by her maids. Whereat his lady screamed and had the vapours, and asked how he would like to see his own footmen flaunting about the house in powder. Whereat he, always a reasonable man despite his hasty temper, went out and told his footmen to wear powder henceforth. And in this they obeyed him. And there arose a Lord of the Treasury, saying, "Let powder be taxed." And it was so, and the tax was paid, and powder was still worn. And there came the great Reform Bill, and the steam engine, and all manner of queer things, but powder did not end. For custom hath many lives. Nor was there an end of those things which the nobility and gentry had long since shed from their own persons, as laced coats, and velvet breeches, and silk hose. Forasmuch as without these powder could not aptly be. And it came to pass that there was a great war, and there was also a Russian Revolution, greater than the French one. And it may be that everything will be changed fundamentally and soon, or it may be merely that Sir John will say to his lady, "My dear, I have decided that the footmen shall not wear powder and not wear livery any more," and that his lady will say, "Oh, all right." Then at length will the 18th century vanish altogether from the face of the earth. Some of the shallower historians would have us believe that powder is deleterious to the race of footmen. They point out how plenteously footmen abounded before 1790, and how steadily their numbers have declined ever since. I do not dispute the statistics. One knows from the table talk of Samuel Rogers that Mr. Horne Tooke, dining tete-a-tete with the First Lord Lansdowne, had counted so many as 30 footmen in attendance on the meal. That was a high figure, higher than in Rogers' day, and higher far, I doubt not, than in ours. What I refuse to believe is that the wearing of powder has caused among footmen an ever-increasing mortality. Powder was forced on them by their employers because of the French Revolution, but their subsequent fewness is traceable rather to certain ideas forced by that revolution on their employers. The nobility had begun to feel that it had better be just a little less noble than heretofore. When the news of the fall of the Bastille was brought to him, The first Lord Lansdowne, I conceive, remained for many hours in his study, lost in thought, and at length, rising from his chair, went out into the hall and discharged 2 footmen. This action may have shortened his life, but I believe it to be a fact that when he lay dying some 15 years later, he said to his heir, "Discharge 2 more." Such enlightenment and adaptability were not to be wondered at in so eminent a Whig. As time went on, even in the great Tory houses, the number of retainers was gradually cut down. Come the industrial age, hailed by all publicists as the millennium, looms were now tended and blast furnaces stoked by middle-aged men who in their youth had done nothing but hand salvers, and by young men who might have been doing just that if the Bastille had been less brittle. Noblemen, becoming less and less sure of themselves under the impact of successive reform bills, wished to be waited on by less and less numerous gatherings of footmen. And at length, in the course of the Great War, any nobleman not young enough to be away fighting was waited on by an old butler and a parlour-maid or 2, and the ceiling did not fall. Even if the war shall have taught us nothing else, this it will have taught us, almost from its very outset, to mistrust all prophets, whether of good or of evil. Pray stone me if I predict anything at all. It may be that the war and that remarkable by-product, the Russian Revolution, will have so worked on the minds of noblemen that they will prefer to have not 1 footman in their service. Or it may be that all those men who might be footmen will prefer to earn their livelihood in other ways of life. It may even be that no more parlour-maids and housemaids, even for very illustrious houses, will be forthcoming. I do not profess to foresee. Perhaps things will go on just as before. But remember, things were going on even then. Suppose that in the social organism generally, and in the attitude of servants particularly, the decades after the war shall bring but a gradual evolution of what was previously afoot. Even on this mild supposition must it seem likely that some of us will live to look back on domestic service, or at least on what we now mean by that term, as a curiosity of past days. You have to look rather far behind you for the time when the servant question, as it is called, had not yet begun to arise. To find servants collectively knowing their place, as the phrase not is but was, you have to look right back to the dawn of Queen Victoria's reign. I am not sure whether even then those Georgian notice boards still stood in the London parks to announce that ladies and gentlemen are requested and servants are commanded not to do this and that. But the spirit of those boards did brood over the land. Servants received commands, not requests, and were not obliging, but obedient. As for the tasks set them, I dare say the footmen in the great houses had an easy time. They were there for ornament. But the comparatively few maids there, and the maid or 2 in every home of the rapidly increasing middle class, were very much for use, having to do an immense amount of work for a wage which would nowadays seem nominal. And they did it gladly, with no notion that they were giving much for little, or that the likes of them had any natural right to a glimpse of liberty, or to a moment's more leisure than was needed to preserve their health for the benefit of their employers, or that they were not in duty bound to be truly thankful for having a roof over their devoted heads. Rare and reprehensible was the maid who, having found one roof, hankered after another. Improvident, too, for only by long and exclusive service could she hope that in her old age she would not be cast out on the parish. She might marry, meanwhile? The chances were very much against that. That was an idea misbeseeming her station in life. By the rules of all households, followers were fended ruthlessly away. Her state was sheer slavery? Well, she was not technically a chattel. The law allowed her to escape at any time after giving a month's notice, and she did not work for no wages at all, remember. This was hard on her owners? Well, in ancient Rome and elsewhere her employers would have had to pay a largish sum of money for her down to a merchant. Economically, her employers had no genuine grievance. Her parents had handed her over to them, at a tender age, for nothing. There she was. And if she was a good girl and gave satisfaction, and if she had no gypsy strain to make her restless for the unknown, there she ended her days, not without honour from the second or third generation of her owners. As in ancient Rome and elsewhere, the system was, in the long run, conducive to much good feeling on either side. Quote, "Poor Anne remained very servile in soul all her days, and was altogether occupied from the age of 15 to 72 in doing other people's wills, not her own." End quote. Thus wrote Ruskin in Praeterita of one who had been his nurse and his father's. Perhaps the passage is somewhat marred by its first word, but Ruskin had queer views on many subjects. Besides, he was very old when, in 1885, he wrote Praeterita. Long before that date, moreover, others than he had begun to have queer views. The halcyon days were over. Even in the 60s there were many dark and cumulus clouds. It was believed, however, that these would pass. Punch, our ever-quick interpreter, made light of them. Absurd that Jemima Jane should imitate the bonnets of her mistress and secretly aspire to play the piano. Punch and his artists, as you will find in his old volumes, were very merry about her, and no doubt his readers believed that his exquisite ridicule would kill, or his sound good sense cure, the malady in her soul. Poor misguided girl! Why was she flying in the face of nature? Nature had decreed that she should command, others obey; that some should sit imperative all day in airy parlours, and others be executive in basements. I dare say that among the sitters aloft there were many whose indignation had a softer side to it. Under the Christian emperors, Roman ladies were really very sorry for their slaves. It is unlikely that no English ladies were so in the 60s. Pity, after all, is in itself a luxury. It is for the some a measure of the gulf between themselves and the others. Those others had now begun to show signs of restiveness, but the gulf was as wide as ever. Anthony Trollope was not, like Punch, a mere interpreter of what was upmost in the average English mind. He was a beautifully patient and subtle demonstrator of all that was therein. Reading him, I soon forget that I am reading about fictitious characters and careers. Quite soon do I feel that I am collating intimate memoirs and diaries. For sheer conviction of truth, give me Trollope. You, too, if you know him, must often have uttered this appeal. Very well. Have you been given Orley Farm? And do you remember how Lady Mason felt after confessing to Sir Peregrine Orme that she had forged the will? As she slowly made her way across the hall, she felt that all of evil, all of punishment, had now fallen upon her. There are periods in the lives of some of us, I trust but of few, when, with the silent inner voice of suffering... And here, in justice to Trollope, I must interrupt him by saying that he seldom writes like this, and I must also, for a reason which will soon be plain, ask you not to skip a word. We call on the mountains to fall and crush us, and on the earth to gape open and take us in, when with an agony of intensity we wish our mothers had been barren. In these moments the poorest and most desolate are objects to us of envy, for their sufferings can be as nothing to our own. Lady Mason, as she crept silently across the hall, saw a servant girl pass down towards the entrance to the kitchen, and would have given all that she had in the world, to change places with that girl. But no change was possible to her. Neither would the mountains crush her, nor the earth take her in. This was her burden, and she must, etc., etc. You enjoyed the wondrous bathos? Of course. And yet there wasn't any bathos at all, really. At least, there wasn't any in 1862, when Orley Farm was published. Servants really were most desolate in those days, and their sufferings were less acute only than those of gentlewomen who had forged wills. This is an exaggerated view? Well, it was the view held by gentlewomen at large in the 60s. Trust Trollope. Why, to a modern gentlewoman, would it seem so much more dreadful to be crushed by mountains and swallowed by earthquakes than to be a servant girl passing down towards the entrance to the kitchen? In other words, how is it that servants have so much less unpleasant a time than they were having half a century ago? I should like to think this melioration came through our sense of justice, but I cannot claim that it did. Somehow our sense of justice never turns in its sleep till long after the sense of injustice in others has been thoroughly aroused. Nor is it ever up and doing till those others have begun to make themselves thoroughly disagreeable. And not even then will it be up and doing more than is urgently required of it by our convenience at the moment. For the improvement of their lots, servants must, I am afraid, be allowed to thank themselves rather than their employers. I am not going to trace the stages of that improvement. I will not try to decide in what year servants passed from wistfulness to resentment, or from resentment to exaction. This is not a sociological treatise. It is just an essay, and I claim an essayist's privilege of not groping through the library of the British Museum on the chance of mastering all the details. I confess that I did go there yesterday, thinking I should find in Mr. and Mrs. Sidney Webb's History of Trade Unionism the means of appearing to know much. But I drew blank. It would seem that servants have no trade union. This is strange. One would not have thought so much could be done without organisation. The mere spirit of the time, sneaking down the steps of areas, has worked wonders. There has been no servants' campaign, no strategy, nothing but an infinite series of spontaneous and sporadic little risings in isolated households. Wonders have been worked, yes, but servants are not yet satiated with triumph. More and more, on the contrary, do they glide, long before the war they had begun gliding, away into other forms of employment. Not merely are the changed conditions of domestic service not changed enough for them, they seem to despise the thing itself. It was all very well so long as they had not been taught to read and write, but there, no doubt, is the root of the mischief. Had the governing classes not forced those accomplishments on them in 1872... But there is no use in repining. What's done can't be undone. On the other hand, what must be done can't be left undone. Housework, for example. What concessions by the governing classes, what bribes, will be big enough hereafter to get that done? Perhaps the governing classes will do it for themselves, eventually, and their ceilings not fall. Or perhaps there will be no more governing classes, merely the state and its swarms of neat little overseers, male and female. I know not whether in this case the sum of human happiness will be greater, but it will certainly, it and the sum of human dullness, be more evenly distributed. I take it that under any scheme of industrial compulsion for the young, a certain number of the conscripts would be told off for domestic service. To every family in every flat, houses not legal, would be assigned one female member of the community. She would be 20 years old, having just finished her course of general education at a municipal college. 3 years would be her term of industrial, subsection domestic, service. Her diet, her costume, her hours of work and leisure would be standardized, but the lenses of her pince-nez would be in strict accordance to her own eyesight. If her employers found her faulty in work or conduct, and proved to the visiting inspector that she was so, she would be penalised by an additional term of service. If she, on the other hand, made good any complaint against her employers, she would be transferred to another flat, and they be penalised by suspension of their licence to employ. There would always be chances of friction, but these chances would not be so numerous nor so great as they are under that lack of system which survives today. Servants would be persons knowing that, for a certain period, certain tasks were imposed on them, tasks tantamount to those in which all their coevals were simultaneously engaged. Today they are persons not knowing, as who should say, where they are, and wishing all the while they were elsewhere, and mostly, as I have said, going elsewhere. Those who remain grow more and more touchy, knowing themselves a mock to the rest, and their qualms, even more uncomfortably than their demands and defects, are always haunting their employers. It seems almost incredible that there was a time when Mrs. Smith said, "Sarah, your master wishes," or Mr. Smith said, "Sarah, go up and ask your mistress whether—" I am well aware that the very title of this essay jars. I wish I could find another, but in writing one must be more explicit than one need be by word of mouth. I am well aware that the survival of domestic service, in its old form, depends more and more on our agreement not to mention it. Assuredly a most uncomfortable state of things. Is it, after all, worth saving? A form so depleted of right human substance, an anomaly so ticklish? Consider, in your friend's house, the cheerful smile of yonder parlour-maid. Hark to the housemaid's light, brisk tread in the corridor. Note well the slight droop of the footman's shoulder as he noiselessly draws near. Such things, as being traditional, may pander to your sense of the great past. Histrionically, too, they are good. But do you really like them? Do they not make your blood run a trifle cold? In the thick of the great past you would have liked them well enough, no doubt. I myself am old enough to have known 2 or 3 servants of the old school, later editions of Ruskin's Anne. With them there was no discomfort, for they had no misgiving. They had never wished, heaven help them, for more, and in the process of the long years had acquired, for inspiration of others, much. A fine mellowness, the peculiar sort of dignity, even of wisdom, that comes only of staying always in the same place, among the same people, doing the same things perpetually. Theirs was the sap that rises only from deep roots, and where they were you had always the sense of standing under great wide branches. One especially would I recall who... No, personally I admire the plungingly intimate kind of essayist very much indeed, but I never was of that kind, and it's too late to begin now. For a type of old-world servant, I would recall rather some more public worthy, such as that stout old hostler whom, whenever you went up to stay in Hampstead, you would see standing planted outside that stout old hostelry, Jack Straw's Castle. He stands there no more, and the hostelry can never again be to me all that it was of solid comfort. Or perhaps, as he was so entirely an outside figure, I might rather say that Hampstead itself is not what it was. His robust but restful form, topped with that weather-beaten and chin-bearded face, was the hub of the summit of Hampstead. He was as richly local as the pond there, that famous pond which in hot weather is so much waded through by cart-horses, and is at all seasons so much barked around by excitable dogs, and cruised on by toy boats. He was as essential as it and the flagstaff and the gorse and the view over the valley away to Highgate. It was always to Highgate that his big blue eyes were looking, and on Highgate that he seemed to be ruminating. Not that I think he wanted to go there. He was Hampstead born and Hampstead bred, and very loyal to that village. In the course of his life he had "been down to London a matter of 3 or 4 times," he would tell me, "and slept there once." He knew me to be a native of that city, and, for he was the most respectful of men, did not make any adverse criticism of it. But clearly it had not prepossessed him. Men and horses, rather than cities, were what he knew, and his memory was more retentive of horses than of men. But he did, and this was a great thrill for me, after some pondering at my behest, remember to have seen in Heath Street, when he was a boy, a gentleman with summat long hair settin' in a small cart takin' a pictur. To me, Ford Madox Brown's work is, of all modern pictures, the most delightful in composition and strongest in conception, the most alive and the most worth while, and I take great pride in having known someone who saw it in the making. But my friend himself set little store on anything that had befallen him in days before he was took on as stable lad at the castle. His pride was in the castle, wholly. Part of his charm, like Hampstead's, was in the surprise one had at finding anything like it so near to London. Even now, if you go to districts near which no great towns are, you will find here and there an inn that has a devoted waiter, a house with a fond butler. As to butlers elsewhere, butlers in general, there is one thing about them that I do not at all understand. It seems to be against nature, yet it is a fact, that in the past 40 years they have been growing younger and slimmer. In my childhood they were old, without exception, and stout. At the close of the last century they had gradually relapsed into middle age, losing weight all the time, and in the years that followed they were passing back behind the prime of life, becoming willowy juveniles. In 1915, it is true, the work of past decades was undone. Butlers were suddenly as old and stout as ever they were, and so they still are. But this, I take it, is only a temporary setback. At the restoration of peace, butlers will reappear among us as they were in 1915, and anon will be losing height and weight too, till they shall have become bright-eyed children with pattering feet. Or will their childhood be of a less gracious kind than that? I fear so. I have seen from time to time butlers who had shed all semblance of grace, butlers whose whole demeanour was a manifesto of contempt for their calling, and of devotion to the spirit of the age. I have seen a butler in a well-established household strolling around the diners without the slightest droop, and pouring out wine in an off-hand and quite obviously hostile manner. I have seen him, towards the end of the meal, yawning. I remember another whom, positively, I heard humming, a faint sound indeed, but menacing as the rolls of tumbrils. These were exceptional cases, I grant. For the most part, the butlers observed by me have had a manner as correctly smooth and colourless as their very shirt-fronts. Aye, and in 2 or 3 of them, modern though they were in date and aspect, I could have sworn there was a flame of old-world fealty all bright. Were these but the finer comedians? There was one, I will call him Brett, who had an almost dog-like way of watching his master. Was this but a calculated touch in a merely aesthetic whole? Brett was tall and slender, and his movements were those of a greyhound under perfect self-control. Baldness at the temples enhanced the solemnity of his thin, smooth face. It is more than 20 years since first I saw him, and for a long period I saw him often, both in town and in country. Against the background of either house he was impeccable. Many butlers might be that. Brett's supremacy was in the sense he gave one that he was, after all, human, that he had a heart in which he had taken the liberty to reserve a corner for any true friend of his master and mistress. I remember well the first time he overstepped sheer formality in relation to myself. It was one morning in the country, when my entertainers and my fellow guests had gone out in pursuit of some sport at which I was no good. I was in the smoking-room reading a book. Suddenly... No, Brett never appeared anywhere suddenly. Brett appeared, paused at precisely the right speaking distance, and said in a low voice, "I thought it might interest you to know, sir, that there's a white-tailed magpie out on the lawn. Very rare, as you know, sir. If you look out of the window you will see the little fellow hopping about the lawn." I thanked him effusively as I darted to the window and simulated an intense interest in the little fellow. I greatly overdid my part. Exit Brett, having done his to perfection. What worries me is not that I showed so little self-command and so much insincerity, but the doubt whether Brett's flawless technique was the vehicle for an act of true good feeling, or was used simply for the pleasure of using it. Similar doubts abide in all my special memories of him. There was an evening when he seemed to lose control over himself. But did he really lose it? There were only 4 people at dinner: my host, his wife, their nephew, a young man famous for drollery, and myself. Towards the end of dinner the conversation had turned on early marriages. "I," said the young man presently, "shall not marry till I am 70. I shall then marry some charming girl of 17. His aunt threw up her hands, exclaiming, "Oh, Tom, what a perfectly horrible idea! Why, she isn't born yet." "No," said the young man, "but I have my eye on her mother." At this, Brett, who was holding a light for his master's cigarette, turned away convulsively, with a sudden dip of the head, and vanished from the room. His breakdown touched and pleased all 4 beholders. But was it a genuine lapse, or merely a feint to thrill us? The feint of an equilibrist so secure that he can pretend to lose his balance. If I knew why Brett ceased to be butler in that household, I might be in less doubt as to the true inwardness of him. I knew only that he was gone. That was fully 10 years ago. Since then I have had one glimpse of him. This was on a summer night in London. I had gone out late to visit some relatives and assure myself that they were safe and sound, for Zeppelins had just passed over London for the first time. Not so much horror as a very deep disgust was the atmosphere in the populous quiet streets and squares. One square was less quiet than others, because somebody was steadily whistling for a taxi. Anon I saw the whistler silhouetted in the light cast out on a wide doorstep from an open door, and I saw that he was Brett. His attitude, as he bent out into the dark night, was perfect in grace, but eloquent of a great tensity, even of agony. Behind him stood a lady in an elaborate evening cloak. Brett's back must have conveyed to her in every curve his surprise, his shame that she should be kept waiting. His chivalry in her behalf was such as Burke's for Marie Antoinette. Little had he dreamed that he should have lived to see such disasters fallen upon her in a nation of gallant men, in a nation of men of honour and of cavaliers. He had thought 10,000 taxis must have leaped from their stands, etc. The whistle that at first sounded merely mechanical and ear-piercing had become heart-rending and human when I saw from whom it proceeded, a very heart-cry that still haunts me. But was it a heart-cry? Is Brett more than a mere virtuoso? He is, in any case, what employers call a treasure, and to any one who wishes to go forth and hunt for him, I will supply a chart showing the way to that doorstep on which last I saw him. But I myself, were I ever so able to pay his wages, should never covet him, no, nor anything like him. Perhaps we are not afraid of men-servants if we look out at them from the cradle. None was visible from mine. Only in later years, and under external auspices, did I come across any of them. And I am as afraid of them as ever. Maidservants frighten me less, but they also, except the 2 or 3 ancients aforesaid, have always struck some degree of terror to my soul. The whole notion of domestic service has never not seemed to me unnatural. I take no credit for enlightenment. Not to have the instinct to command implies a lack of the instinct to obey. The two aptitudes are but different facets of one jewel, the sense of order. When I became a schoolboy, I greatly disliked being a monitor's fag. Other fags there were who took pride in the quality of the toast they made for the breakfasts and suppers of their superiors. My own feeling was that I would rather eat it myself, and that if I mightn't eat it myself, I would rather it were not good. Similarly, when I grew to have fags of my own, and by morning and by evening one of them solemnly entered to me bearing a plate on which those 3 traditional pieces of toast were solemnly propped one against another, I cared not at all whether the toast were good or bad, having no relish for it at best, but could have eaten with gusto toast made by my own hand, not at all understanding why that member should be accounted too august for such employment. Even so in my later life. Loath to obey, loath to command. Convention, for she too frightens me, has made me accept what servants would do for me by rote. But I would liefer have it ill done than ask even the least meddlesome of them to do it better, and far liefer, if they would only be off and not do it at all, do it for myself. In Italy, dear Italy, where I have lived much, servants do still regard service somewhat in the old way, as a sort of privilege, so that with Italian servants I am comparatively at my ease. But oh, the delight when on the afternoon of some local festa there is no servant at all in the little house! Oh, the reaction, the impulse to sing and dance, and the positive quick obedience to that impulse! Convention alone has forced me to be anywhere a master. Ariel and Caliban, had I been Prospero on that island, would have had nothing to do and nothing to complain of. And Man Friday, on that other island, would have bored me, had I been Crusoe. When I was a king of Babylon and you were a Christian slave, I promptly freed you. Anarchistic? Yes. And I have no defence to offer, except the rather lame one that I am a Tory anarchist. I should like every one to go about doing just as he pleased, short of altering any of the things to which I have grown accustomed. Domestic service is not one of those things. And I should be glad if there were no more of it. End of section 11. Section 12 of And Even Now by Max Beerbohm. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 12. Going Out for a Walk. 1918. It is a fact that not once in all my life have I gone out for a walk. I have been taken out for walks, but that is another matter. Even while I trotted, prattling, by my nurse's side, I regretted the good old days when I had, and wasn't, a perambulator. When I grew up, it seemed to me that the one advantage of living in London was that nobody ever wanted me to come out for a walk. London's very drawbacks, its endless noise and hustle, its smoky air, the squalor ambushed everywhere in it, assured this one immunity. Whenever I was with friends in the country, I knew that at any moment, unless rain were actually falling, some man might suddenly say, "Come out for a walk," in that sharp, imperative tone which you would not dream of using in any other connection. People seem to think there is something inherently noble and virtuous in the desire to go for a walk. Anyone thus desirous feels that he has a right to impose his will on whomever he sees comfortably settled in an armchair reading. It is easy to say simply no to an old friend. In the case of a mere acquaintance, one wants some excuse. I wish I could, but nothing ever occurs to me except I have some letters to write. This formula is unsatisfactory in 3 ways. 1. It isn't believed. 2. It compels you to rise from your chair, go to the writing table, and sit improvising a letter to somebody until the walk-monger, just not daring to call you a liar and hypocrite, shall have lumbered out of the room. 3. It won't operate on Sunday mornings. "There's no post out till this evening" clinches the matter, and you may as well go quietly. Walking for walking's sake may be as highly laudable and exemplary a thing as it is held to be by those who practise it. My objection to it is that it stops the brain. Many a man has professed to me that his brain never works so well as when he is swinging along the high road or over hill and dale. This boast is not confirmed by my memory of anybody who, on a Sunday morning, has forced me to partake of his adventure. Experience teaches me that whatever a fellow guest may have of power to instruct or to amuse when he is sitting on a chair or standing on a hearth-rug quickly leaves him when he takes one out for a walk. The ideas that came so thick and fast to him in any room, where are they now? Where that encyclopedic knowledge which he bore so lightly? Where the kindling fancy that played like summer lightning over any topic that was started? The man's face that was so mobile is set now. Gone is the light from his fine eyes. He says that A, our host, is a thoroughly good fellow. 50 yards further on he adds that A is one of the best fellows he has ever met. We tramp on another furlong or so, and he says that Mrs. A is a charming woman. Presently he adds that she is one of the most charming women he has ever known. We pass an inn. He reads vapidly aloud to me, "The King's Arms, licensed to sell ales and spirits." I foresee that during the rest of the walk he will read aloud any inscription that occurs. We pass a milestone. He points at it with a stick and says, "Uxminster, 11 miles." We turn a sharp corner at the foot of a hill. He points at the wall and says, "Drive slowly." I see, far ahead, on the other side of the hedge bordering the high road, a small notice board. He sees it too. He keeps his eye on it. And, in due course, "Trespassers," he says, "will be prosecuted." Poor man. Mentally, a wreck. Luncheon at the A's, however, salves him, and floats him in full sail. Behold him once more the life and soul of the party. Surely he will never, after the bitter lesson of this morning, go out for another walk. An hour later, I see him striding forth with a new companion. I watch him out of sight. I know what he is saying. He is saying that I am rather a dull man to go for a walk with. He will presently add that I am one of the dullest men he ever went for a walk with. Then he will devote himself to reading out the inscriptions. How comes it, this immediate deterioration in those who go walking for walking's sake? Just what happens? I take it that not by his reasoning faculties is a man urged to this enterprise. He is urged, evidently, by something in him that transcends reason. By his soul, I presume. Yes, it must be the soul that raps out the "quick march" to the body. "Halt! Stand at ease!" interposes the brain. And "To what destination?" it suavely asks the soul. "And on what errand are you sending the body?" "Oh, no errand whatsoever," the soul makes answer, "and to no destination at all. It is just like you to be always on the lookout for some subtle ulterior motive. The body is going out because the mere fact of its doing so is a sure indication of nobility, probity, and rugged grandeur of character. Very well, Vagula, have your own way, Eula. But I, says the brain, flatly refuse to be mixed up in this tomfoolery. I shall go to sleep till this is over." The brain then wraps itself up in its own convolutions and falls into a dreamless slumber from which nothing can rouse it till the body has been safely deposited indoors again. Even if you go to some definite place for some definite purpose, the brain would rather you took a vehicle. But it does not make a point of this. It will serve you well enough, unless you are going for a walk. It won't, while your legs are vying with each other, do any deep thinking for you, nor even any close thinking. But it will do any number of small odd jobs for you willingly, provided that your legs also are making themselves useful, not merely bandying you about to gratify the pride of the soul. Such as it is, this essay was composed in the course of a walk this morning. I am not one of those extremists who must have a vehicle to every destination. I never go out of my way, as it were, to avoid exercise. I take it as it comes, and take it in good part. That valetudinarians are always chattering about it, and indulging in it to excess, is no reason for despising it. I am inclined to think that, in moderation, it is rather good for one, physically. But, pending a time when no people wish me to go and see them, and I have no wish to go and see anyone, and there is nothing whatever for me to do off my own premises, I never will go out for a walk. End of section 12.